New Zealand sells you a postcard. The harbour bridge at dawn. A rope bridge swaying over a glacier-fed river. Tourists laughing. Cameras out. The Kawarau Gorge with a bungee cord and a scream of pure joy. That is the version on the brochure. The version in the airline magazine. The version every tourism board in Wellington wants you to remember. But talk to the people who actually live beside these crossings. The ones who drive over them at night, who grew up hearing what their grandparents wouldn't fully explain. And you get a different story. Some of these bridges were built on the backs of men who didn't survive the job. Some of them have swallowed cars, coaches, entire families. Some of them were built for a future that never arrived and now stand over rivers leading nowhere at all. Today, I want to take you to 10 of them. Bridges the locals cross, with a tighter grip on the wheel if they cross them at all. Some for practical reasons, blind corners, one lane, a river with a temper. Some for reasons that are harder to put a name to. Go on, subscribe, and I'll tell you the whole story. Number 10, the old Kopu Bridge on State Highway 25 just south of Thames on the Coromandel side of the Hauraki Plains. For the better part of a century, if you wanted to get onto the Coromandel Peninsula from the south, you crossed the Waiho River on a narrow single-lane wooden-decked bridge built in 1928. It carried holiday traffic, log trucks, farm utes and school buses, all funneled into one lane with passing bays and a set of traffic lights at either end that most visitors didn't understand until they were already halfway across. The official history is straightforward enough. It was, for its time, a perfectly reasonable piece of engineering, a truss bridge doing exactly what it was designed to do. But ask anyone from Thames what Kopu Bridge actually meant to them, and the word that comes up again and again is fear. Head-on collisions happened with a regularity that the traffic lights never quite solved, because impatient drivers misjudged the gap, or the lights malfunctioned, or somebody simply didn't want to wait behind a log truck for 3 minutes on a hot summer day. Locals talk about specific crashes the way people elsewhere talk about weather events, by year, by family name, by which panel of the bridge got dented that time. The new 4-lane Kopu Bridge finally opened in 2011, after decades of petitions and at least one fatal accident too many for the regional council to keep delaying. The old bridge still stands beside it, closed to vehicles now, a pedestrian and cycling crossing kept as a monument to what it used to demand of the people who used it. Stand on it at dusk, and you can still see, if you know where to look, the places where the timber deck was patched and repatched over 90 years, each patch marking a moment somebody didn't quite make it across. The council called it a valued piece of regional infrastructure. The people who lost someone on it call it something else entirely, and they don't always say it out loud. What makes Kopu worth starting with is how ordinary it looks. There's no cliff edge here, no dramatic gorge, no volcanic backstory. It's a flat river crossing on the way to a holiday peninsula, the kind of bridge you drive over without a second thought. It's precisely why it earned its reputation the way it did, not through spectacle, but through repetition. Year after year, holiday weekend after holiday weekend, the same bottleneck, the same impatience, the same river underneath, indifferent to any of it. Thames Coromandel locals still talk about the summer traffic queues that used to back up for kilometres on the southern approach. Families sitting in stationary cars in the heat, tempers wearing thin, exactly at the point where patience mattered most. The bridge didn't need to be dramatic to be dangerous. It just needed drivers who had run out of patience and a single lane that gave them no room to be wrong. Number 9. The Awakino Gorge on State Highway 3, where the road threads along the Awakino River through the King Country before it reaches the Tasman Sea. The bridge itself is unremarkable to look at. A modest steel structure carrying the highway across the river at the narrowest point of the gorge. But it sits at the tail end of one of the most notorious stretches of road in the North Island. Blind corners cut into limestone cliffs on one side, a drop to the river on the other. And for decades, a road surface that gave drivers almost no margin for error. The New Zealand Transport Agency's own safety assessments over the years have rated sections of this gorge among the highest risk rural roads in the country, citing curved geometry, limited sight distance, and a crash history that kept repeating itself in almost the same locations. That is the official language. The unofficial language from people in Awakino and Mokau who have lived beside this road their whole lives is a list of names, of neighbours, of relatives, of the tourists who didn't know the road and paid for it. Local trucking families have their own informal rules for the gorge that never made it into any government document. Which corners you never take without slowing, which stretch you don't attempt in fog, which side of the bridge itself you stay tight to even when nothing is coming. It is knowledge passed down the way a family passes down a recipe, except this one exists because the alternative was learned the hard way more than once. The gorge has been upgraded repeatedly, wider lanes in places, better barriers, improved sight lines, and the crash numbers have genuinely come down. But mention the Awakino bridge to someone from the district and watch their shoulders change. It isn't superstition, it's memory, sitting exactly where the road narrows and the cliff comes in close. There's a smaller detail here that doesn't make it into any transport report, but that locals bring up more often than you'd expect. The gorge sits close to a stretch of coastline with genuine cultural significance to local iwi, land that was never simply empty country waiting for a highway. The road through Awakino was carved through territory that had its own history long before a single steel girder went in. And older residents will sometimes point out that the difficulty of the crossing was never purely a matter of bad engineering. It was always difficult land, chosen for a road because there was nowhere gentler to put one. That context rarely makes it into the safety statistics, but it shapes how the district talks about the place, and it's part of why nobody here treats the gorge as just another stretch of tarmac. Number 8. The Buller Gorge Swing Bridge, near Murchison on the South Island's west coast. At 110 metres, it is the longest swing bridge in New Zealand, strung across the Buller River at a spot chosen more than a century ago for gold. The original crossing here dates back to the 1880s, built to serve the miners working the riverbanks and the settlers, pushing further into country that the rest of the colony still considered close to the edge of the map. The official story, the one told on the visitor centre signage today, is a tidy tale of adventure tourism, a swing bridge, a river, a zip line added decades later for thrill seekers. What gets left off the plaque is the 1929 Murchison earthquake, a magnitude 7.8 event that tore this valley apart, killed 17 people in the district, and reshaped the very riverbed the bridge crosses. Landslides buried farms. The earth opened in places. Survivors described a valley that no longer matched the maps they had grown up with. The swing bridge that stands today isn't the original. It has been rebuilt more than once, partly because of that earthquake, and partly because rivers like the Buller do not forgive old engineering. Locals in Murchison will tell you the ground here still isn't fully trusted, even a century on. Geological surveys confirm the district sites on genuinely active fault country, which is a scientific fact, not folklore. But standing on a swing bridge that moves with your footsteps over a river that once swallowed the valley floor whole, it is hard not to feel the difference between a fact on a report and a fact under your boots. Ask an old Murchison local whether they trust the ground here, and more than a few will simply say, ask it again after the next one. The 1929 earthquake gets a small museum in Murchison now, and it's worth visiting if you're ever in the district because it does something most official histories avoid. It names people. Photographs of families standing in front of houses split clean in half. Accounts of farmers who dug their own neighbours out of landslides with hand tools because no help could reach them for days. The swing bridge over the Buller, rebuilt and re-strengthened in the decades since, has become an odd kind of monument to that resilience. A structure that flexes with the river instead of fighting it, in a valley that has learned, the expensive way, exactly how much the ground here can decide to move on its own. Number 7. Skipper's Canyon, in the hills above Queenstown, and the narrow bridge that carries the old gold mining road across the Shotover River Gorge. Built in 1901, the road itself remains one of the most dangerous public roads in New Zealand. Most rental car companies still forbid their vehicles from driving it at all. cut into sheer rock, wide enough for one vehicle in most places, with a drop to the river below that leaves no room for a mistake. The gorge was carved out by hand, quite literally, by miners chasing gold in a rush that peaked in the 1860s and never fully left. Roughly 200 men worked this road with picks and dynamite over more than a decade, and the district's own historical records concede that the toll on the workforce was significant. Falls, blasting accidents, and the simple attrition of working a cliff face with primitive tools in a gorge that offered no mercy. Official mining registers from the period are frustratingly thin on individual names. Many of the men who died building the road into skippers were itinerant labourers, and nobody was keeping careful records of who they left behind. What survives instead is local memory, families in the Wakatipu Basin, who still point to specific bends and say, "That's where the coach went over. That's where the drill rig lost its footing." The gold that drew men here made a handful of people extraordinarily wealthy. It also buried an uncounted number of them in a canyon that swallows detail the way it swallows sound. Today the road and its narrow bridge are a tourist attraction, driven in four-wheel drive vans by guides who know every blind corner by heart. They tell the gold rush story well. What they can't tell you, because nobody kept the paperwork, is exactly how many men the canyon actually took. What's genuinely strange about skippers is the contrast between how briefly the gold rush lasted and how permanently it reshaped the land. Within a couple of decades, the easy gold was gone, and most of the miners moved on to the next rush, the next river, the next promise. What they left behind was a road that shouldn't have been possible to build with the tools available at the time, cut into rock that modern engineers still treat with genuine respect. The canyon kept the road long after it stopped needing the men who built it, which is its own kind of quiet unfairness. The thing that outlived them wasn't their names, it was the cliff face they cut through to get rich. Number 6. The Kawarau Gorge Suspension Bridge, a short drive from Queenstown. The bridge that the whole world now associates with a rubber cord and a scream. Built in 1880 by engineer Harry Higginson to connect the goldfields on either side of the Kawarau River. It was, for its era, an audacious piece of engineering. A single-span suspension bridge across a gorge that had previously forced travellers into long, dangerous detours or risky river crossings. The tourism version of this bridge's story begins in 1988, when it became the site of the world's first commercial bungee jump, and that part of the history is well documented and genuinely remarkable. What tends to get skipped is the 8 years it took to build the original structure and the conditions the construction crews worked under. A gorge with sheer rock faces, a fast, cold river below, and equipment that by modern standards was barely adequate for the task. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the period record injuries during construction as a routine hazard of the job, the kind of thing noted in passing rather than investigated. The gorge itself has a long-standing local reputation that predates any of this. Maori accounts describe the Kawarau as a river with genuine power and danger, respected long before European miners arrived chasing gold. That history is not superstition. It's a river that runs cold, fast and deep through a landscape that has claimed lives on both sides of colonization. So when a tourist today straps into a harness and steps off that same bridge for the thrill of the fall, they are doing it above a gorge that has represented risk to everyone who has ever stood on its edge, for reasons that have nothing to do with adrenaline tourism at all. The bridge remembers, even if the marketing brochure doesn't mention it. There's a kind of irony in what the Kawarau Bridge became. A structure built by exhausted men to move gold and supplies safely across a dangerous gorge has been turned a century later into a place where people pay good money to fling themselves off it deliberately. I don't say that as criticism. The bungee operation here is run with genuine care and an excellent safety record, and thousands of people have had the best 5 seconds of their lives on that cord. But it's worth sitting with the strangeness of it for a moment. The very danger the original engineers spent 8 years trying to neutralize has been repackaged, generations later, as entertainment. The gorge didn't get any less serious. We just changed our relationship to it. We're already past the halfway mark, and I want to say something honest before we keep going. If you're finding this as unsettling as I do telling it, that's not an accident. some of what's coming is heavier still. Subscribe to show that these videos actually help and that they make sense. It costs you nothing, and it tells me this kind of digging is worth continuing. Number 5. The Rakaia Gorge Bridge, spanning the Rakaia River in Canterbury, roughly an hour's drive from Christchurch. The current bridge, opened in 1982, replaced an earlier crossing and now carries traffic high above a milky turquoise braided river that has carved one of the more dramatic gorges in the Canterbury foothills. Officially, it's simply infrastructure, a well-engineered road bridge doing its job, popular with tourists for the view and with jet boat operators running trips beneath it. Unofficially, among people in the surrounding districts, the bridge carries a heavier reputation, the kind that towns generally don't advertise. Like a number of high isolated crossings around the country, it has, over the years, been the site of deaths that were not accidental, a pattern serious enough that mental health organisations have at times raised concerns about high-profile bridges becoming associated in the public imagination with that kind of ending. I'm not going to describe those events in any detail, and honestly, I'd rather use this moment differently. If you are watching this, and something in your own life feels like standing at the edge of a gorge with nowhere to go, please don't carry that alone. In New Zealand, Lifeline is available anytime, day or night, on 0800 543 354. Talk to someone. That call matters more than any bridge story I could tell you. What the Rakaia Gorge does show, in a broader sense, is how a landscape this beautiful can hold two entirely different meanings for the people who live near it. To a visitor with a camera, it's simply glorious. Turquoise water, high cliffs, a bridge like something out of a film. To a local family who has lost someone there, it's a place they now drive past in silence, eyes forward, radio on. Both of those things are true of the same bridge, at the same time, and neither cancels the other out. Number 4. The Waiho Bridge, at Franz Josef on the west coast, crossing the Waiho River where it flows down from the Franz Josef Glacier. This one is different from the others on this list, because its danger isn't hidden in the past. It is ongoing, documented, and arguably getting worse. The Waiho River is what geologists call an aggrading river, meaning its bed is actually rising over time, filled constantly with rock and glacial silt ground down by the retreating ice above. The riverbed here has risen so dramatically that in places it now sits higher than parts of the township itself, protected only by stop banks that engineers have had to raise again and again. The bridge crossing this river has been destroyed by flooding multiple times in living memory, most recently and most dramatically in March 2019, when a major flood tore out a significant span of the structure entirely, cutting off the only road link between Franz Josef and the townships to the south for weeks. West Coast Regional Council engineers have been remarkably candid about the scale of the problem, describing the Waiho as one of the most geologically unstable river crossings in the country, and warning in public reports that the long-term solution may eventually require moving the highway itself rather than continuing to rebuild in the same location. That is about as close as an official body gets to admitting that a piece of infrastructure is losing a fight it cannot ultimately win. For the people of Franz Josef, this isn't an abstract engineering debate. It's their only road out. Locals watch the river's gravel banks the way farmers elsewhere watch the sky before a storm, because they have learned, through repeated and expensive experience, that the Waiho does not ask permission before it takes back what it wants. The bridge gets rebuilt every time. Nobody in the district believes that arrangement is permanent. If that one unsettles you a little, hold that feeling, because we're about to head somewhere with an even stranger relationship between people and moving ground. But the Waiho deserves one more moment first, because it says something uncomfortable about how this whole country works. Franz Josef exists because of the glacier, the town's entire economy, its guest houses, its helicopter tours, its reason for being on the map at all comes from people wanting to stand near the ice. The same glacier that draws them here is quietly filling the riverbed with the ground-up rock that keeps destroying the only road home. The town isn't fighting a random disaster. It's living, permanently, in the runoff of the exact thing that pays its bills. Number 3. The Hapuawhenua Viaduct, near Ohakune in the central North Island, part of what was once the main trunk railway line, and is now a walking and cycling trail through the Tongariro area. Built in 1908 as a curved steel viaduct carrying the railway across a deep bush valley, it was at the time one of the more ambitious pieces of engineering on the entire North Island main trunk line. A graceful curve of iron trestle work standing high above native forest. The official histories celebrate the line's completion in 1908 as a triumph of colonial engineering, connecting Auckland and Wellington by rail for the first time, and opening up the Central Plateau to settlement and trade. What those same histories tend to summarise quickly in a single respectful sentence is the cost. Construction crews working in remote, densely forested terrain, often in appalling weather, using little more than picks, shovels and horse-drawn equipment, suffered a steady toll of injuries and deaths that period newspapers reported in short, unemotional paragraphs, the way workplace deaths were often reported at the time. A name, a cause, a location, and nothing more. The viaduct itself was replaced by a straighter, more modern structure in the early 1980s, and the original 1908 span was left standing, no longer carrying trains, slowly being reclaimed by the surrounding bush. Today, it forms part of the old Coach Road walking track, and visitors who cross it on foot often remark on how eerily quiet it is. A century-old feat of ironwork standing in silence in the forest, doing nothing anymore except being beautiful and being remembered. Local rail heritage groups have worked for years to preserve the structure, and they'll tell you, if you ask, that preservation here isn't really about the iron. It's about not letting the men who built it become as invisible in memory as they were in the newspaper columns that first recorded their deaths. There's a particular kind of stillness on that viaduct that I've never quite felt anywhere else on this list. No traffic, no crash statistics, no dramatic river below waiting to reclaim anything. Just bird song, wind through the trestle work, and 100 and some years of quiet standing between you and the men who put it there. Heritage volunteers have slowly restored small sections, replacing rivets and repainting ironwork by hand, on weekends, largely unpaid, because they believe a structure like this deserves to be maintained rather than simply left to rust politely into the bush. It's one of the few places on this list where the reflection is less about danger and more about debt. The debt every one of us owes to labour nobody thought worth writing down properly at the time. Number 2. The bridge to nowhere, deep in the Whanganui River Valley, reachable only by boat or a long walk through the Whanganui National Park. It is, without question, one of the strangest structures in the entire country. A substantial, well-built concrete bridge, standing in dense native forest, connected to no road at all. The official history explains the paradox cleanly enough. After the First World War, the government offered land in this remote valley to returned soldiers under a rehabilitation settlement scheme, encouraging them to clear the bush and farm the steep river terraces. The bridge was completed in 1936, intended to link the settlement to a road that was meant to be built to connect it with the rest of the country. That road was never finished. The soil here, once cleared of native forest, proved to be poor, unstable farmland on some of the steepest country in the North Island. And one by one, the soldier settler families abandoned their blocks through the 1930s and 40s, defeated by isolation, flooding and land that simply would not support what they had been promised it could. By the time the bridge was finished, there was almost nobody left to use it. The bush has spent the decades since reclaiming everything else the settlers built. The houses, the fences, the cleared paddocks have all gone back to forest. But the bridge itself, built to a standard meant to outlast a road that never came, has simply refused to disappear. It stands now purely as a monument, visited by kayakers and trampers who arrive by the same river the original settlers depended on, because there is still no other way in. There's something almost unbearably honest about a bridge built for a future that the government promised and then failed to deliver. It didn't fail through negligence exactly. The land itself failed the plan, and the men who trusted that plan paid for it with years of their lives. The bridge remains structurally sound, leading from forest into forest, a monument to a promise the country simply could not keep. And that brings us to number one. Not a single bridge this time, but several. The buried river crossings of Te Wairoa near Lake Tarawera in the Bay of Plenty. A village that vanished in a single night in June 1886. Te Wairoa was, before that night, a genuinely thriving settlement, the tourist gateway to the famous pink and white terraces, then considered one of the natural wonders of the world. The village had proper roads, footbridges over its streams, guest houses, a mill, and a population living comfortably off the steady flow of Victorian-era tourists arriving to see the terraces. On the 10th of June, 1886, nearby Mount Tarawera erupted with almost no warning in one of the most violent volcanic events in New Zealand's recorded history. Ash, mud, and rock buried Te Wairoa entirely. At least 120 people died that night, most of them Maori residents of the village and surrounding Kainga. The pink and white terraces themselves were destroyed, an international sensation simply erased from the map in a matter of hours. The official geological record of the eruption is thorough and well studied. Scientists have reconstructed the sequence of events in remarkable detail, and the eruption remains a benchmark case study for volcanologists worldwide. What the geology can't fully capture is the human layer underneath it. Local accounts passed down through Idaiwi in the district describe warnings before the eruption. Strange sounds. A phantom war canoe reportedly seen on the lake days earlier by multiple witnesses, described by a respected local guide named Sophia Hinarangi, whose own testimony was recorded and taken seriously at the time. Whether that sighting was a genuine premonition, a trick of light and weather, or a story reshaped by grief in the retelling, is a question nobody has ever been able to answer with certainty, and it remains debated in both academic and iwi accounts to this day. Excavations at the buried village site, ongoing since the early 20th century, have slowly uncovered the footbridges, house foundations, and streets of Te Wairoa exactly as they stood the moment the ash fell. A settlement frozen midlife, its crossings leading to nothing now but excavated pits and interpretive signage. Walking the site today, you cross reconstructed paths above the actual buried streets below. The original bridges of a real, living community sitting meters beneath your feet, sealed under more than a century of volcanic debris. There is no clean lesson in Te Wairoa. There is only a village that trusted a mountain that had been quiet for centuries, and a landscape that reminded everyone, in a single night, exactly whose country this really is. What makes the buried bridges of Te Wairoa different from everything else on this list is scale. Every other crossing tonight has been a story about one road, one river, one community's particular relationship with danger. Te Wairoa is a story about an entire settlement, its economy, its footbridges, its guest houses, and well over 100 lives. All of it erased in the space of a single night by a mountain that had given no one any reason to expect it. The survivors who rebuilt afterward, in nearby settlements around the lake, carrying whakapapa and memory forward, even after the physical village was gone, never had the luxury of a plaque or a museum exhibit to process what happened. They simply carried it, the way communities up and down this country have had to carry so much of what the land has taken from them, generation after generation, largely without ceremony. If you've been to any of these places yourself and noticed something about them I haven't mentioned here, I would genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments. I read everyone, and this channel gets better because of what you add to it. What strikes me, looking back across all 10 of these crossings, is how differently New Zealand tells its own story, depending on who's doing the telling. The council sees infrastructure, the engineer sees load ratings and flood models, but the people who actually live beside these bridges, who cross them every week of their lives, carry a different version entirely, one built out of names, dates, and the specific bend in the road, where something happened to someone they knew. Both versions are true. Neither one is the whole picture without the other. A bridge is just steel and timber and concrete until the people around it decide what it means. And in this country, more often than the tourism boards would like, what it means is grief that never quite got a plaque. I think about that a lot when I drive across a bridge I don't know the history of, which, honestly, is most of them. Somewhere behind almost every crossing in this country, there's a version of the story that never made it onto a sign, a name that never got carved anywhere permanent, a family that still goes quiet at a particular bend in the road for reasons a passing tourist would never guess. None of that is unique to New Zealand, I know that, but there's something about a country this young, this small, and this connected by memory that makes the gap between the official version and the real one feel closer to the surface than it does almost anywhere else I've stood. I am a grandpa, and grandpas worry. Look after yourself.